Hey, I wanted to let you know there are some dates below in the description of some live events coming up that you may not want to miss. And also, while I have your attention, check out my playlists to see some content that maybe you missed already that you'll be glad you found. That's all.
You're a wonderful man, in your satin tights.
Condor Man. Hi, I'm Peter Franson from christiangeekcentral.com and Spirit Blade Productions. Welcome to Essential Issues, where I talk about my favorite DC comics of the past that are still affordably available today, blabbing about why they are special to me and what, if anything, they have to say about the essential issues of real life. Now, warning, this series does freely contain spoilers, but I think even spoiled, the stories I feature are still well worth reading. At this point in the series, we're covering major events in DC Comics history, stuff that was status quo changing, or at the very least very memorable and significant in the lives of one or more characters. Last time we covered Green Lantern Hal Jordan's turn to the dark side in Green Lantern Emerald Twilight. That's issues 48 through 50 of the 90s series. Now we're looking at what was the biggest crossover event in DC Comics since Crisis on Infinite Earths, which is one of the first stories I covered in this series. And this story, called 0 Hour, made major changes to DC continuity and the status quo as well for numerous characters. And it's also a pretty essential follow-up story to Emerald Twilight, as we find out in the course of this story what Hal Jordan has been up to since that story ended. Revisiting this story, I've been reading it through the DC Universe Infinite service. You can get it in trade paperback form. If you get it in trade paperback, it'll include the short stories that contribute, that are kind of a prelude to the main 0 Hour event in Showcase 94, issues number 8 and 9. There's short stories in both of those that lead up to, and I think are actually pretty important to read. And so if you choose to read this digitally through the service, you can just do a search for 0 Hour. It'll take you to a listing of all the books and tie-ins for the story. But I would say that apart from the Showcase issues, Showcase 94 issues 8 and 9, you don't need to read any of these other tie-ins to 0 Hour if you don't want to, unless you're particularly interested in the characters that are featured in those stories. So I'm going to start by making some comments on Showcase 94 number 8. There's a short story here that features the Linear Men that are kind of like these watchers of time in the DC Universe, who have been joined by Wave Rider at some point. Wave Rider was the main protagonist through whose eyes we were seeing events in Armageddon 2001, which I also covered as part of this series. So this is also kind of a nice follow-up to Armageddon 2001 in a way. But they've noticed in their watchings of time that Monarch has resurfaced, and he's gotten his hands on some tech and is showing some aptitudes that he never had before. And Hank Hall, who became Monarch in Armageddon 2001, seems to be after specifically time travel tech of some kind. So Wave Rider and one of the Linear Men go after Monarch. They have a confrontation with him that does not go well for them. But what we learn, and what Hank Hall has come to realize, is, he used to be the superhero Hawk, and his partner was Dove, and he realizes that they were the offspring of the Lords of Order and Chaos, these very old, mystical, extremely powerful beings. And what he realizes is that when he killed Dove, something of her essence, of her being, particularly of the aspect of the Lords of Order that she represented, kind of bonded with him. And so he became, or harbors inside of him now, the combined powers of both of those two aspects, of the aspects of Hawk and Dove. Anyway, this realization brings about a transformation where he is now something much more powerful than Monarch was ever going to be. Monarch was this guy in high-tech, futuristic armor, but that's essentially all that he was, but now he realized that who I am without this armor and this tech and stuff is actually much more powerful. He now calls himself extant. And thanks to his new powers and also getting his hands on a time-traveling armband of one of the linear men, he now has the ability to travel freely through time. And that's the last time we see him. Wave Rider and the Linear Man are just left behind thinking, oh crap, it's really hit the fan now. And the story is continued in 0 Hour number 4. Number 4 because this series counts down from 4 to 0 instead of traditional numbering. Now, beginning in 0 Hour number 4, I start to just see the similarities between this and Crisis on Infinite Earths. It's a time-based crisis that is affecting all of reality. All of reality is ultimately at stake here. There's some very big, sweeping imagery on comic book covers of multiple heroes all facing this big, giant threat. And it also starts to show resemblances very soon to the writing style of Crisis on Infinite Earths in that it's heavily focused on exposition. It's definitely not as painful to read to me now as going back and trying to read Crisis on Infinite Earths, but it still has a lot of cumbersome dialogue. There's an exchange between Batman and Robin and Batgirl, who at this point, Barbara Gordon had been paralyzed by the Joker for years. She was functioning as Oracle, kind of a hacker partner to multiple superheroes in the DC Comics universe. But here suddenly Barbara Gordon as Batgirl shows up and she's just fine. And so there's, people are going like, what the crap is going on? That we have parallel realities and parallel timelines starting to kind of converge and do wonky things. But the dialogue, we got Batman saying, you're healthy again. And instead of saying, you're walking again, I don't know, that seems a little odd to say you're healthy again. Then Robin says, she looks okay to me, really okay. So I guess he's really into her, But then she replies, what's wrong? You're acting like I was sick or injured, but I'm fine, always have been. And I feel like as I was rereading this story, I gained an appreciation for how big crossover events have been handled more recently in DC, such as the what is it called? The Doomsday Clock story, which was a really slow burn. To get to the continuity changing, the status quo changing stuff that they eventually got to. The same thing was the case, even though I've not read it all, I've skimmed enough of it to know this to be the case, with DC, the Rebirth event. There was a one-shot comic that kind of set some major things in motion, but then the whole thing was explained and played out in numerous issues across the DC universe over, I think, a period of at least a year or two. The time they take to let these characters breathe. And I mean, this little brief interaction between Batman, Robin, and a walking Batgirl, I think could have played out over several issues of the Batman comics, and let that story breathe. Let us really see how these characters react emotionally to seeing this person in a very different way, And so I think that 0 Hour, just kind of spoilers on what my ultimate thoughts are on this, I think is worth reading because of the major status quo changes that came about and things that you will want to know about certain characters that we'll get to in a little bit here. But other than that, I don't think it's worth reading just as a story in its own right. It's hard to read in that way for me. Not as hard, again, as Crisis on Infinite Earths, but it's pretty clunky by comparison to so many comics that have come since then. So then we cut to a scene where one of the Linear Men and Wave Rider have come to Wally West. He's in the 64th century on some kind of Wally West time-traveling Flash adventure. And they approach him because they think he might be the solution to repairing what's going on with time. All these timelines are converging. Actually, it seems like the universe, the timeline of the entire universe is eating itself inward from the outside in. And so they are hoping that he can be a part of the solution. So then a bunch of technobabble explains what he should do, which involves really, running super, super fast, but faster than he has ever run before, or at least since kind of being depowered and slowed down considerably very soon after the events of Crisis on Infinite Earths. So, I mean, this came out in mid-90s, so for about 10 years, Wally West has, I think, not gone much faster than breaking the sound barrier. Wave Rider sees what he's doing, sees how much he's pushing himself, realizes something is wrong, tries to tell him to stop, saying this is a suicide run. But Wally very heroically keeps pushing himself, and then in a scene very reminiscent to the Crisis on Infinite Earth scene that involves Barry Allen's death, his body begins fading away from just converting into light energy maybe or something. He's just getting pulled apart by what he's doing, and all that's left is the Flash costume, which was all that had been left of Barry. So again, more parallels to Crisis on Infinite Earths, a big event involving time and the death of a Flash. Now, long-term Flash fans will know this actually was not the death of Wally West, but it was the first time that he entered into what was called the Speed Force. And this was a major new starting point for Wally, discovering how fast he could really go and all the different applications of super speed that the Flash comics became known for years after starting with this. I mean, this is the beginning, really, of a golden era for the Flash comics with the incorporation of the Speed Force in enhancing and diversifying all that Wally, as the Flash, is capable of doing. Around this time, Metron, who is one of the new gods, guy who is super intelligent, floats around in his awesome Mobius chair and just kind of intervenes during big events like this, is recognizing that there's a cosmic crisis going on and all of reality is going to be destroyed unless, of course, Earth's heroes somehow band together. And so he goes and gets in touch with Superman to get Superman to basically recruit a bunch of heroes, all hands on deck to help with this. Green Lantern helps, new Green Lantern, Kyle Rayner, it's worth saying, helps him by putting a projection of Superman out across the DC universe so that all these different superheroes see this projection and answer the call to come and join him in helping to save all of reality. So then we pick it up in 0 Hour number 3, the next issue. And Jay Garrick, the original Flash, has learned of the death of Wally, who was like a son or a grandson to him. He's already dealt with the death of Barry, and now he's dealing with this. And so we see him kind of mourning that some. And about the same time, the Justice Society is brought into the story, and they're going to be very significant in this story. This was... this kind of story is about changing the status quo a lot of the time. It's just kind of a device they use to make a bunch of changes that they think are going to improve their publishing line. That's ultimately what these kinds of stories are for. And little did readers know that some major stuff was going to go down with the Justice Society. Stuff that probably ticked off a lot of readers, similar in some ways to how I felt like the Justice Society was treated with the launch of the New 52. Maybe they seem to be getting the short end of the stick in the fallout of these big cosmic reality-changing events. This story, as we see one Flash seemingly head out, was also a significant part of the introduction for the character Impulse. And they seem to be setting him up, especially in the wake of Wally's apparent death. They seem to be setting him up as a new speedster, maybe someone that's going to take up the mantle of the Flash at some point. He says he definitely doesn't want to be called Kid Flash, but he's certainly able to move very fast and vibrate through walls, which was something that Wally was not able to do. And so it certainly would have seemed at the time oh, okay, this is going to be the guy that's going to take the Flash's place now. And there's definitely a lot of heroes that, as in Crisis on Infinite Earths, show up in this one. Probably not as many. I mean, Crisis was such a huge deal and they were trying to clean up so much. But still, there's a lot of who's who types of pages in 0 Hour that can help remind you of characters that existed or make you curious about characters that you maybe are seeing for the first time. So then after one or two big spreads of tons and tons of heroes, we jump back over to the Justice Society, who's traveling through time with Wave Rider, trying to be a part of the solution to this cosmic problem. And Hawkman and Hawkwoman, or maybe it's Hawkgirl, I can't remember what she was being called at this point, become the center of attention. And with all this crazy parallel earthy, multiple timeliney stuff going on, we see numerous versions of Hawkman and Hawkwoman and Hawkgirl kind of appearing all at once as time is going nuts. And they seem to be merging into this kind of single primal essence of the concept of who Hawkman is. Even like Hawk Girl gets merged into this amalgamated version of Hawkman. It's just Hawkman that is left standing, and it's a big mystery as to what the crap he is now. And I didn't follow the Hawkman comics, but so maybe they did clean up some mess, but there was still plenty of mess to clean up, and I didn't have an understanding of who Hawkman is, or I didn't know of a version of his origin that was simple and interesting and that I felt like I could get excited about until Jeff Johns basically reintroduced him in the pages of JSA a number of years after this. So, man, unless it was cleared up in the Hawkman comic books, which I don't know, I would think this would in some ways just add to the mess, because what is this new Hawkman's origin story now? He's the weird amalgamation of a bunch of time travel, multiple reality stuff that went on. I mean, that's a weird origin for a guy named Hawkman. So in addition to making big changes in the DC Universe, they also use this story to remind readers of recent changes. For example, Guy Gardner runs into Kyle Rayner. He's like, "Oh, who are you?" And Kyle's like, "Green Lantern." He's like, "Oh, okay, well, you and me got to talk." And Kyle's like, "Actually, I'd like that." And then also we have characters that knew Donna Troy as Wonder Girl before, and now she's a Dark Star, which is kind of like a, in my opinion, second-rate Green Lantern Corps. And they're like, "Oh, you're a Dark Star now," and stuff. And these things don't really affect the main plot. They're just kind of thrown in here, I think, probably in hopes of readers going, "Oh, that's an interesting status quo change. I wonder what that's about." And then, of course, following the details in the respective books of those characters. So now we cut, I guess I was wrong before, I don't think they were with the Justice Society, but now we do cut to the Justice Society, and Extant is going up against these guys and doing all kinds of time-powery stuff to take them down. And not just taking them down, but killing them, like aging them at super speed. They had various things to keep them, relatively young since their prime, as World War II heroes. But even at this point in the 90s, if they hadn't had various things over the years prevent them from aging at a regular rate, they would have been too old for readers, I think, to feel like they could realistically be out fighting crime. I think they were kind of perpetually in maybe their 50s would be my guess. So Extant basically uses his power to force them to catch up with what their ages really ought to be. And so now they're like these late 70s, 80s, maybe even 90-year-old men. So Extant basically, in this way, takes out the entire Justice Society, either aging some of them to death right then and there, or aging the rest to be so debilitated that they can't do anything, and it's clear that their crime-fighting days are over. The only one that seems to survive the process is Green Lantern. And by Green Lantern, I mean the original Green Lantern, Alan Scott, who by other means more recently was really made young, so that he's like in his late 20s, early 30s again. And somehow his ring is able to protect him from what Extant is doing. So now we're counting down and into issue 2, and Extant in this form where he has apparently absorbed the powers of Wave Rider is kind of facing off with Wave Rider. Wave Rider, of course, has all kinds of questions, but Extant isn't interested in answering those. He more or less just twirls his mustache and then disappears, continuing with his dastardly deeds. Then we cut to Superman and a bunch of superheroes that are, it's a big roll call type thing. One thing, though, that I have to say I appreciate about 0 Hour Over Crisis is it's less forced exposition, and a few character moments are allowed to creep in. Just elements of characters' personalities, like Kyle Rayner having a thought bubble where he's like, "Come on, Kyle, think of something," and he's trying to be useful. So showing little indications of his insecurity. We also have the Ray, who's kind of making some smart alecky comments and stuff, and is getting on other people's nerves a little bit because of it. And so it's nice to see those kinds of things creeping in to the writing style at this point. Of course, it still is way too crunched, way too rushed for my preferences. I would much rather this story breathe a whole lot more, but it's nice to see things going in that direction. Then we got another one of these moments. I mean, I'm not going to be talking about the plot much, you guys, because there's a lot of plot beats that involve superheroes combining their powers in some way that is supposed to make sense, but it's just a bunch of techno-babble, and it all amounts to them all blasting something really hard all at once, and that's the key to saving the day. It unfortunately robs these moments of tension because they don't feel like earned moments at all. It's just like this explanation that somebody pulls out of a hat and says, "Okay, well, doing this, which makes no sense, and you can't even tell what I'm saying, but this plan will work." And we just go, "Okay," we shrug and we go, "Okay, I guess it'll work." And so after a while, you start to feel, at least I start to feel like, well, what am I worried about? Because there's always going to be some nonsensical explanation or some nonsensical plan that this really super brainy guy is going to be able to come up with that, of course, just involves a bunch of heroes blasting something at the same time. They're going to be fine. There'll be some technobabble thing that someone will come up with. A problem not so easily solved is the death or the passing or the retirement of these JSA members who've been aged up. We're clearly getting the sense here that this is supposed to be the end for them, their swan song or their retirement in some sense. Starman just all comes out and says, "I'm finished as Starman finished." Alan Scott, although he could recharge his ring, his Green Lantern ring, and he's been, preserved, his youth has been preserved, he kind of talks about feeling old on the inside, and so he says, "You know what, I'm done too," and gives his ring to Kyle Rayner and says, "From now on, you are the only Green Lantern." And this does not feel motivated by the character or even the moment that we've seen here, because Alan Scott has certainly been through horrible moments in the past. This feels like an editorial choice, like that there was an editorial mandate, and I'm sure there was, that Kyle Rayner be the only character with the name Green Lantern. I mean, the Green Lantern Corps had already been kind of destroyed at this point. Alan Scott was never a part of the Green Lantern Corps, but evidently that still does not save him from this editorial mandate, and he has to retire as well to make way for Kyle Rayner. And I understand, in one sense, that they're wanting to simplify things and have a jumping on point for new readers, and I'm thankful that actually this didn't stick very long. On a similar note, Jay Garrick, the first Flash, likewise says, it's time for me to just retire and take care of the living at this point. We see Impulse in frame, indicating that he is passing the torch on to Impulse at this point. He even goes so far as to tear the lightning bolt off of his shirt, and I'm trying to remember if that stuck at all in the Flash comics. I think very soon after this, he was active in some sense as this part of the supporting cast for Wally West, and I think this is also the oldest we ever saw him look. As soon as he reappears in Flash, he's looking already, I think, a little bit younger, and progressively starts looking closer to his 50s eventually, and they eventually explain that as, I think, the Speed Force keeping him young or reinvigorating him in some way. They try, especially with Alan Scott and Jay Garrick, the original Green Lantern and Flash, respectively, to give them this noble send-off, almost like a freeze frame from that old astronaut movie, The Right Stuff, where you got these heroic astronauts walking down the hallway to get on the space shuttle, and that's what these guys are doing. They're walking off into the sunset. They get this sunset cowboy kind of moment, and everyone's just looking on in awe and respect, and so it was clearly supposed to be this kind of a goodbye moment for them, but it doesn't stick. I mean, Jay Garrick as the Flash is very quickly appearing in Flash comics and is back in action before long, and it didn't take much longer for Alan Scott to discover that he still had it in him to be a hero. In fact, it might have been like just 5 years or less after this that maybe closer to 6 or 7, that JSA as a comic book started, and these guys had been making little out-of-retirement brief appearances leading up to that, but I'm glad that this was not the end of the original Green Lantern and the original Flash. Now, I should mention there's plenty of stuff going on in this story that I am not touching on, not just because they have to do with what I think are nonsensical technobabble plot beats, but also because they're dealing with characters that I was not following at the time that clearly have some backstory baggage that I am completely lost about. But as is the case with these kinds of events, I think readers are just going to tend to connect to and remember those things that have to do with characters that they know about and are interested in. They kind of tend to forget the rest. It's a lot of pieces they're trying to maneuver in these things to kind of get the universe to the status quo they want it to be at. Anyway, back into the main action, we've got Extant, or Hank Hall, showing up again, but this time he's not made of Wave Rider energy. This is a version of Extant that is earlier in his individual timeline than the other one we had just seen a few scenes ago. And the older Extant, who has been converted into Wave Rider energy type stuff, is watching from his sinister monitor room across time somewhere, and he's like, yes, this is happening just as I remember it. Do it, take him. And then we have this moment where Extant, Hank Hall, thrusts his fist into Wave Rider and basically dissipates his energy and absorbs it so that he then becomes like Wave Rider, this kind of energy, this chronal energy being. The problem with this is it just seems like so many other things, something that happens just because the writer wants it to happen, not because there is precedent about this character that would make this a logical outcome of applying his powers. Hawk and Dove, as far as I know, didn't have any ability to absorb energy or stuff that would result in this. And yes, they're descended from Lords of Order, so maybe combining their powers unlocked some latent things that I don't know. The point is, it doesn't feel led up to. It doesn't feel earned. It feels like the bad guy can just do whatever the writer wants him to do. And so the drama of a story like this is just in the shocks of what it is changing about the status quo, which on a first reading, if you have been invested in the DC universe up to this point, is going to be shocking, is going to have these moments you go, whoa, But as a story itself, going back and just reading it as a story, it doesn't function dramatically very well, I don't think. So anyway, Extant completes his transformation, and entropy starts just consuming the era of time that he is currently in. And as he fades away, we see in the foreground Alan Scott's Green Lantern ring left on the ground. And a mysterious figure whose face we do not see picks it up and says, a forgotten icon from a fallen hero. Better to take it as a trophy than to watch it vanish. That's the first little bit of foreshadowing of who this person is. This is the first time we've seen a mystery figure that is outside of the main villain Extant. Then some other techno-babbly stuff happens. The heroes seem to save the 30th century, and Extant is looking on as like, wait a minute, how is this happening? I looked ahead into the future. I saw how this was supposed to play out. I was supposed to win here. I knew I was going to succeed. How is this happening? And so just after introducing the mystery figure, for the first time we see Extant kind of losing a little bit. Then we cut back to the mystery figure who's in the 30th century, and even though the heroes a moment ago had saved it and then they disappeared and went back to their time, their respective time periods or whatever, he shows up and just quietly reopens the rift of entropy to, as he says, make things happen correctly. And with that, he now decides he is going to let the Green Lantern ring he picked up be destroyed. He drops it on the ground, but he doesn't just let it get swallowed by entropy. He steps on it and crushes it, which is, again, even stronger foreshadowing about who this character is. So now we're in issue number 1, and the heroes are confused because entropy is continuing to dissolve different timelines and shrink in upon them in the modern era. They thought they had saved the day in the places they were supposed to save the day, but they haven't realized yet that another player has come on the scene that is making up for Extant's failures. Then we get ever closer to the mystery player being revealed as Extant looks on at what's happening. Despite what he thought was his failure, entropy is still approaching. He's like, I don't get what's going on. And, this isn't my doing. And then over his shoulder, a shadowed figure says, none of this is your doing. You've run amok in my plans long enough, Extant. So apparently he's just kind of like a second-tier villain, a chess piece being used by someone above him, more powerful. He says, you've forgotten who's in charge here, and debilitates him with a massive green energy blast. The hints are getting stronger and stronger. And at this point, he stands over a fallen Extant and says, you're done. I'm taking over. Don't get in my way again, or I'm going to remove you from this entire equation. Getting closer to his reveal here, the mystery character blasts Time Trapper, one of the few time travelers left, and then kind of reveals his tactics a little bit. He says he was the last to die. The only time travelers left are a couple of linear men, and they don't have the power to stop me. So like Extent, he has some clear agenda to remake time in a particular way and is systematically killing or getting out of the way any time travelers that could potentially stop him. Meanwhile, in the modern era, we have characters that are fading away and disappearing because the time periods that they originate from are being, whether that's the past or the future, are being swallowed by entropy that's again coming in from both sides, sandwiching them closer and closer from both the past and the future. Then Jay Garrick, the Flash, huffing and puffing, gets to where he can contact the Spectre, his old teammate from the Justice Society's World War II days. Now that there's been a villain revealed, he goes to the Spectre and requests help, saying there is a huge evil at work here. So the Spectre is now committed to being involved, but it seems to be too late for Jay Garrick, who fades away and disappears, no doubt because the time period he was born in the early 20th century, is being swallowed by entropy. Then after seeing more heroes swallowed up or even killed in some cases, there's a last-ditch experiment to turn Matthew Ryder, an alternate reality, alternate timeline version of the man who became Wave Rider. Remember, Wave Rider just got disintegrated or absorbed not too long ago. Well, this other alternate timeline Matthew Ryder agrees to go through the process that made the other Matthew Ryder into Wave Rider. So a Wave Rider is reborn, and he comes in, he's got a big, huge, like, I don't want to say a full-page spread, but like a nice big image of him coming onto the scenes, like, okay, this is the hero moment, this is what's going to set things right. With Wave Rider in play now against Extant, there's just enough going on that they're able to distract him. Wave Rider tells Superman, this is the crucial moment, Superman, take him, and Superman's coming at him from behind. But then we zoom on a brutal fist to the face that knocks Superman backward. And if you read Emerald Twilight and found it memorable, then you will remember that fist and know exactly what's coming on the next page. Heroes look on in shock and dismay. Hal Jordan comes on the scene, and he is indeed the evil that is greater even than Extant and more powerful even than Extant. And this is the first time that he introduces himself as Parallax. This is interesting. He says, I've taken the name Parallax. I've seen the universe from many different directions, and I know how to fix it, even if it means destroying it. Now, that name makes sense. He kind of just describes, seeing things from different perspectives. Okay, yeah, that parallax, that makes sense. Honestly, though, for what Hal Jordan is now, it's still kind of a strange name. It seems a little bit forced. It feels more like Parallax, the writer's thought or the editor's thought, was just a cool-sounding word, and we'll just come up with some rationale for why he would name himself this cool-sounding word. Similarly, years down the road, when they would bring back Hal Jordan, they would explain that he actually was not the one going evil and psychotic here. He was being possessed by the entity that is at the heart of yellow energy in the universe. That's the source, basically, of the Yellow Lanterns or Sinestro Corps members' power. That being is called Parallax. Now, why that weird alien entity would be called Parallax makes absolutely no sense to me. I would have thought that they would at least kind of do a respelling of some kind and just say it's an alien word. It just happens to sound like our English Earth word for parallax. That would have made more sense to me. They never went that route. It seemed like ripe for the plucking, but no, they just kind of want us to accept that for some reason the strange yellow alien entity is named Parallax. Anywho, this is still, at least at the time, this big dramatic moment, especially for a Green Lantern fan like me, to see the guy who was synonymous with the name Green Lantern for decades be the ultimate villain of this continuity-spanning event and continuity-changing event in DC Comics. And we see his motive from Emerald Twilight carrying over. He says the universe shouldn't be this way. It needs to be set right. He was going after the power of the central battery to gain enough so that he could resurrect Coast City, and now we see that his ambitions have become, like, insanely more huge. But in some ways kind of relatable, you know? And he still sees himself as a hero, which for this time period, this is just the beginning, like the 90s, of heroes and villains becoming more complex. I mean, I'm pretty sure Magneto got to the complex villain state long before Hal Jordan did, but he's, you know, taken on some Magneto vibes. I think critics even kind of made that observation at the time. Green Arrow says here, Hal, tell me you aren't the one who did this. This isn't like you. You're a good man, a hero. And Hal responds, that's exactly why I did this, Oliver. And no one is going to stop me. And in fact, no one does. You know, entropy is looming huger than ever. It has arrived at the present time period, and Hal simply says, this is 0 hour. And it obviously is. But it's not the end of everything. Clearly, this is part of his plan. It's an intended reset. He said it's gone so wrong. All those people, Coast City. The universe needs a protector, a real guardian to right these wrongs. The universe needs me. Time for a new start, clean slate, a remade universe, my universe. And in a series of increasingly fade-to-white panels, he walks off, and we're left wondering, oh my gosh, the DC universe has just been destroyed. What in the world is going to come next? So that brings us then to issue 0, which brings this story to an end, and it turns out that Hal has kind of preserved a bunch of heroes to allow them to witness his recreation of the universe. And he says some interesting things here. You know, again, he reiterates, I'm not crazy at all. I'm the same man I always was, which is why I have the courage to make things right. And, you know, fearlessness is something that Green Lanterns are known for. He goes on to say, see, as superheroes, we were usually so focused on solving the day-to-day problems that we almost missed the bigger ones. And that connects with me because I think to myself, gosh, people have all these kind of political views, and we're all trying to solve problems based on getting the government to function a certain way that we think will be best, when I tend to think that, the core issue is the sin in humanity. We got to figure out how to deal with that. But of course, Hal doesn't, that's not what he's talking about. The bigger issues to him were the destruction of Coast City and even the crisis, he says. But really, even though he doesn't verbalize it, Hal does seem to be trying to correct the problem of evil in general. He thinks that if he can create enough worlds, that there can be a world for everyone to be happy. And the way he's doing this by means of technobabble is he still has basically his Green Lantern-y type of powers, but he's collected a bunch of chronal energy, he says, that he's using to restart the universe. And he reveals that the Guardians gave him the knowledge to recreate the universe. So we can maybe infer from that something about absorbing the power from the central battery also gave him the knowledge of the Guardians or something. I don't know. I'd really like for that to be explored. Unfortunately, it isn't really here or in the Green Lantern comics that he appears in the future. But what he did at some point before all this began was realizing that, you know, he wanted to change all of the universe to make it kind of the perfect reality. He learned how to access the time stream. He says it took some doing, but I assume that's part of the Guardian's knowledge that allowed him to do this. He got into the time stream itself and discovered energy anomalies there that were residue from the Crisis on Infinite Earths, he says, when we all fought the Anti-Monitor. So he went there and basically figured out how to wrangle entropy and use that to destroy all of reality so that he could hit the reset button. And the plans that he has in mind in several ways sound good. He's like, I can bring back most everyone who died. Kilowog, the Core. He's like, I can make 2 Earths, one for the JSA where they can stay eternally young. And Guy Gardner rightly asks, you know, that, after saying that does seem better than old age and death, but what's the price of all this? Then we start seeing a couple other heroes that are kind of out of time, out of continuity from parallel realities, one named the Centurion and Batgirl. And they're starting to wonder, maybe he's got some good points here. After all, if we fight and stop him, then we are going to cease to exist. And Hal Jordan tries to encourage that mentality. He's like, yeah, it will all work out. You'll have your Gotham City, and Alpha Centaurian will have his Metropolis. In my universe, everything will be as it should. Everybody wins. And what they don't get into here that I think is a bit of a missed opportunity is why this plan ultimately will not work. There's the big philosophical question of, why wouldn't God create a perfect world where everyone always chose the right thing? And one compelling answer to that, of course, is choice. That if we want to have a universe in which love means something among creatures, then there has to be the choice to not love. And if that choice is possible, then it's going to happen, and you're going to get the mess that we live in now. And so Hal could recreate the universe, but he's either going to recreate a bunch of automatons, or he's going to recreate a universe that just ends up going bad again. They don't examine that and get philosophical, and I understand why, but it's still something that's interesting here. So then Wave Rider shows up, brings some more heroes with him, and they're ready to attack Hal, but he's like, why? Why would you want to stop me? And Superman says, because you've set yourself up as a god, Hal. You've killed billions. And Hal replies, no, I'm giving life to even more. Can't you see that I'm right, that things will be better? Captain Atom, blasting him, says, you're sick, Hal. No one should toy with life the way you have. And so what's interesting to me is they're upholding the value of the individual life, whereas Hal, in his maniacal state, is really holding more of the straight naturalistic view. It's not a view that naturalists necessarily hold. In fact, most of them don't. Most atheists do not hold to this non-moralistic view in which an individual human life has no virtue. But on the naturalistic view, it's only logical to conclude that life, the individual life of a person, doesn't really have objective value. And so Hal's math checks out. They say, you've killed billions. He's like, I'm giving life to more. Okay, well, yeah, the math checks out. If we're just going to abstractly say that life is good and that perpetuation of life is good, and well, of course that begs the question, why is that the case? But if we're going to say that and grant that, then the logic of the maniacal villain here is spot on. In any case, the Spectre shows up, which makes a ton of sense to me that an agent of God's wrath would be immune to even the destruction of time, and he's determined that Hal will be forced to see justice. In the midst of all this, we do have a nice moment where Oliver Queen, Green Arrow, longtime friend of Hal Jordan, is kind of realizing just the tragedy of what's going on here with his best friend. And in Hal's fight with the Spectre, he exerts himself greatly, expending tons and tons of energy, and actually becomes somewhat vulnerable again. And in that moment, his best friend, Oliver, takes the shot. Hits him square in the chest, and it looks like a fatal wound. Parallax, the ultimate threat in this story, having been defeated, the Spectre says justice is satisfied, only one task remains, and he basically lends his power to this plan that had been going on in the background to use a character named Damage to kind of, restart the universe by recreating the Big Bang. Spectre charges him up with all the potential power he would need to finish the job, and boom! So then, more technobabble, and all the heroes have to be kind of reinserted into the timeline at places that make sense and won't cause the whole thing to happen all over again, or blah blah technobabble. And it's explained that time restarted and was allowed to progress naturally as it did the first time, but with some changes. And so they just kind of mention that, I'm sure, to explain away the various status quo changes that they wanted to make on an editorial level going forward from here. But even after all this cosmic stuff, I do appreciate that the story is allowed to have a quiet, dramatic moment as Green Arrow, Oliver Queen, walks away from the assembled heroes with a dark shadow on his face, and he goes off by himself to just kind of mourn the passing of his friend and how he was the one that actually brought it about. And he smashes his bow, seemingly maybe ready to give up the life altogether. We don't really know, but in any case, he is just overcome with emotion and grief over what he has lost. And the final words suggest that, yes, continuity has been reset, saying there are numerous new mysteries from time's beginning to its very end, where similar matters will be pondered, blah, blah, that's referencing something else. But the universe is consistent and whole, and those answers will unfold in time. So it's just a last little hint. The last little statement is, things are different now, but we're going to show you what's different progressively over time. Now, while I'm not going to talk about it here, I think a nice epilogue to this, especially if you're a Green Lantern fan, is Green Lantern number 0, because that describes what happened to Green Lantern Kyle Rayner, who was holding on to Hal Jordan at the moment that Green Arrow shot him in the chest, and they both seem to disappear into the reassembling timeline. Nobody knows what became of them. Well, they reappear on Oa, and they have a sort of final battle, and after that, Kyle's, is the last remaining Green Lantern, has kind of had a victory over Hal in a sense, but Hal isn't necessarily dead. We just don't know what's happened to him. And as we'll see in the future, maybe not necessarily in stories I focus on here, but Parallax does show up from time to time in other stories. But even so, I think that's a more satisfying end to what happened to Hal than we saw in these pages. And Parallax does continue to be a character going forward, and just the legacy of Hal Jordan being tarnished so significantly. He exists and functions as a villain in the DC Universe for a significant number of years after this. And Hal's time as Parallax continues to be referenced in, all the way into the New 52. So as unsatisfying on a story level as this is to revisit now, I think that in many ways it is essential, at least to my enjoyment of the DC Universe. Very, very big part of my knowledge of and understanding of and enjoyment of this world. Well, that's it for this time. Next time, we're going to zoom back in to more of a single character focus, a little less of an event kind of thing, and yet it is a follow-up to events in Zero Hour. We're going to look at probably the most impactful Flash story in how it changed the status quo for what the Flash could do and how his powers were applied for decades to come. Yes, he was gone and seemingly perished for a little while here in Zero Hour, but in the next story we're going to look at, we see the return of Wally West and a reestablishment of what it means to be a speedster in the DC Universe. That story, of course, is The Flash: Terminal Velocity.